Ukraine and the United States have just finished a difficult round of negotiations. Tough, tense, but as media reports, extremely constructive. At the same time, Russia is pushing its old narratives again, pretending it wants peace while continuing to kill Ukrainians. And globally, China is raising the temperature around Taiwan. With me now is retired Australian general, writer, and friend of Ukraine, Mick. General, thank you for being with us.
It's good to see you again and speak with you today, Natalie.
So, General Ryan, in your Wall Street Journal piece, you argue that Putin has squandered his military opportunity, that despite huge manpower, drones, and foreign support, Russia gained only 0.8% of Ukrainian territory this year. How do you think Putin interprets this contradiction? A strategic failure on the battlefield, but still a sense of political momentum at the negotiation table. Does the math eventually crash into his narrative?
Well, I think the math does not support his narrative, but that doesn't stop him from talking about how all the signs are very positive on all fronts, and that's exactly what he said at a press conference last week for media. He seems to be getting information that everything's looking up for the Russian military forces. That's not quite the case, even though they have made small territorial gains. They've wasted enormous numbers of lives to get there. Putin's real art here is to gain just enough territory to be able to manipulate Donald Trump and others around him into thinking that a Russian victory is inevitable. And that is probably one of the things that Putin has been good at over the last year.
Yes. Also, CNN described the meeting as tough but constructive, which is, classic diplomatic language for disagreement, I would say. When you read between the lines, what does that phrasing really tell you about U.S. expectation versus Ukraine's red lines? Is this a sign of alignment or a sign of a collision ahead?
Well, I think it's I think it's probably a sign that the 28-point plan has been whittled down, and a lot of the pro-Russia bias has probably been removed during the negotiations at this time in Florida, have been led by the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is far more pro-Ukrainian than many of the others in the administration. So I think the language he used is that there probably isn't a quick solution here, notwithstanding the progress that has been made. And he's probably very cautious about whether he would indicate if Russia would agree to this. We've seen no indication at this point in time that they will.
And the U.S. delegation included people with strong political backgrounds, but limited military expertise. Ukraine, meanwhile, arrived with Umerov, Budanov, Khdanov, essentially the entire security and intelligence brain of our country. Does this asymmetry worry you?
Well, I think what the Ukrainian president did with that delegation was to send people who could explain to the Secretary of State exactly what the war situation was, not the kind of inevitable victory propaganda that they're getting from their interlocutors in Moscow. I mean, the General Budanov, I believe, was a last-minute withdrawal, and his deputy, General Skibitsky, was sent. This is a very knowledgeable man, a very clever officer who knows in depth where the war is, what the current situation and the challenges are, and is able to explain that to his American interlocutors. I think that's very important.
But how much do the gaps and experience within Trump's negotiating team increase the risks for Ukraine? Any risks?
Well, I don't think there's a huge amount of gaps in negotiating experience. I mean, Steve Witkoff is a real estate agent. He has zero experience in international diplomacy. Marco Rubio has been in the job for about 10 months. Many of those in the Ukrainian delegation have been negotiating with Americans, Europeans, and Russians for years. So, I think the Ukrainian delegation isn't just experienced in military and intelligence matters. You've got a pretty fair set of negotiators there as well.
And in one of your pieces, you said that dictator Putin is once again claiming that Ukraine's government is illegitimate. Is this preparation to promote some alternative negotiator or just another attempt to delegitimize the Ukrainian state?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. Firstly, it's Putin just rolling out a standard talking point that he's been using ever since there was a decision made not to have another presidential election at the 5-year mark. Now, that made enormous sense to do that because all that would happen is Russia would target Ukrainians voting, and it's not possible under martial law in Ukraine anyway. So I think part of it is just rolling out that standard propaganda talking point. But secondly, I think from a Russian and a Putin perspective, it gives him the ability to knock back, to say no to any prospective peace deal because he doesn't trust the Ukrainian side to hold up their end of the bargain, which, as we all know, is very ironic. Putin would think that. He has never held up a single bargain about a single conflict that he's involved Russia in.
Yes. But he, dictator, also insists that Russia's military is accelerating its progress. From your perspective, is that a real assessment or an information operation aimed at influencing the peace talks?
It's purely an information operation influencing not so much the peace talks. This is aimed directly at Donald Trump, the Vice President of the United States, Steve Witkoff, and the others around them who are not pro-Ukraine, who have a very strong Russia bias and want to see this war over so they can return to making deals and making money.
Yeah, and one more interesting. The resignation of Andriy Yermak is now being used by both Russian propaganda and some American isolationists. Do you see a real risk that this corruption scandal could be used in Washington as a reason to reduce support for Ukraine?
There is certainly that risk, and that's something that Ukraine and its partners will have to work hard to make sure that doesn't eventuate. But on the other side of this is an indication that democracy in Ukraine is working. If it was Russia, those kind of corrupt individuals or those who are alleged to be corrupt would never have surfaced. So, in some respects, this is an indication that Ukrainian democracy is at work here and is something that's worth preserving.
Yeah, I was reading, you said it's institutional maturity. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. Ukraine in its current manifestation is a very young democracy, and it's still learning some of the tough elements of being a democracy, but it's doing it in a more transparent way than many other countries are doing. And as we saw when there was a chance that the government anti-corruption agency might be shut down, Ukrainians came out for the first time during the war this time and protest. So, I think there's a very strong inclination towards democracy among the Ukrainian people, and we need to support that.
But also, General Ryan, how critical was Yermak's role in the negotiations?
Well, no doubt he was an important player because he was or has been at the right hand of the president for the entirety of this war. Probably no one knows how Zelensky thinks, what he might tolerate, what he won't tolerate in talks better than Andriy Yermak. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of other servants of Ukraine who work for the president, who are able to negotiate with the Americans in good faith whilst retaining the trust of the president of Ukraine, and we shouldn't forget that.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to get back to negotiations and Umerov, Budanov, and other security leaders now leading the delegation. Could this be read as a signal that Ukraine is preparing for, to fight as long as it needs, not for any compromises ever?
No, I think the president of Ukraine has been very careful in his signalling to the American president, particularly since that 28 February disaster in the Oval Office. He's been very keen to say that Ukraine is not going to stand in the way of peace, but at the same time, it's not going to support peace at any cost. And I think most of the polls in Ukraine, speaking to Ukrainian people, support that. Ukrainian people all want peace. but Ukrainian people don't want it at the cost of having to live under the boot of the Russians. So, President Zelensky has a very fine tightrope to walk here. He has to be seen in the eyes of Donald Trump to be not standing in the way of peace, but he has to be seen in the eyes of every Ukrainian of supporting the aspirations for Ukraine to remain a sovereign nation that can defend itself.
General Ryan, given the situation on the battlefield, which is quite complicated, are we now entering the most difficult phase of the war?
Well, I think the amount of challenges that are piled up for the president and the government and the military of Ukraine are probably the most difficult since the full-scale invasion in February 2022. If you add up this second corruption scandal, this pressure from America for a quick peace deal, Russia is certainly putting pressure on Ukrainian units on the front line, particularly around Pokrovsk, but also on the Liman and Kupiansk axes. But you're also seeing Russian production of weapons step up and American military aid decline significantly. So all of these add up for what is a very difficult period of the war for the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people. But, the Ukrainian people have proven throughout this war to be highly resilient, innovative, and just very, very tough at defending their homes, defending their country.
Yeah, I'm recalling a moment. It's just getting back to the beginning of our interview when you said that Russia is lying about its achievements and just gained 1.8% of Ukrainian territory this year. And regarding Russian propaganda, I've been to Montenegro this summer, and I remember when I met locals and they asked me, "Are you Russian?" And I said, "No, I'm Ukrainian." And he's like, "Oh, you're losing." And I'm like, wait, where did this information coming from? We are standing strong for almost 4 years of a full-scale invasion. And I'm not talking about the total war. And you could be surrendered in 2 days, but not Ukrainians. And I was so impressed how perfectly Russian propaganda is working on the people's mindset.
Yeah, they are certainly investing in misinformation operations in many countries around the world, not just in Europe. They're doing it in Asia. Certainly, when you go to places like Indonesia, India, and elsewhere, you do hear these Russian messages rolled out by them there. So, the Russians aren't totally stupid. They're very good at propaganda, and they've been using it against Ukraine since the beginning of this war, if not since before that.
And regarding another painful moment, regarding drone safari in Kherson, why is the West not reacting more strongly to Russia's drone safari attacks on civilians in Kherson? Isn't it a time to formally call these strikes what they are, terrorist attacks?
Well, they definitely are that. They're worse than that. They're war crimes. The deliberate targeting of civilians in a war is a war crime, and this is a deliberate and systemic series of war crimes that Russian commanders have encouraged their troops to undertake against innocent civilians in Kherson. Now, the United Nations and other bodies have recognised this with reports, but a report doesn't stop killing. Action does, and no one outside of Ukraine has really called out the Russians, made this part of the negotiations, or forced them to stop. This is a real tragedy, but unfortunately, it's just one of many, many awful war crimes that Russian military and political leaders must be held accountable for at the end of this war.
Yes, I was reading the tactics of Russians, how they are acting in Kherson. So basically, they are just taking drones on remote, of course, and the drones are flying close to the local people, babushkas, grandfathers, just people who just walking somewhere, and then it explodes. Just the target is specifically civilians, not the military people.
No, this is absolutely a terror campaign by the Russians to terrorize Ukrainian people into leaving their home city. I mean, this has been a long-standing campaign. It's been going for about a year now. and they will continue to do that until they feel that they've depopulated this city enough, and then they'll come in and destroy it like they do every other Ukrainian city that they go into. That's their plan. The whole thing now is to ensure that the Russians can't achieve that.
But okay, General Ryan, but if they're gonna depopulate Kherson, an area, then it's gonna somehow be helpful to Ukrainian army as well.
Well, possibly, but I think the Ukrainian army would rather defend well forward of Kherson, not have to defend in the city. And that would be the whole plan. I don't think there's any prospect of the Russians taking Kherson anytime soon. And I think that gives us an insight into why they're undertaking this drone safari. They can't take the land by force, so they're undertaking terror campaigns to force the people to leave. They're doing it in places like Kherson. They've done it in other cities. And they're, engaging in other war crimes like executing prisoners of war, just to demonstrate that they will do anything to subjugate Ukraine.
So true, so Russian. Okay, and General Ryan, finally, the question not about the east of Ukraine, but the east of the world, beyond Ukraine. Beijing is raising its rhetoric on Taiwan. Does this mean the world could face two major crises at the same time, one in Europe and one in Asia?
I think that's very possible. It could be three. I mean, if China decides to do something about Taiwan, certainly Russia will exploit that in Europe, and potentially North Korea could exploit it on the Korean Peninsula. The Taiwanese are very worried. They've increased and sped up their defence spending. That was announced by the president in a opinion piece in an American newspaper last week. The new Japanese Prime Minister has sped up the doubling of their GDP spent on defence by 2 years. They've just passed a bill to do that. So regional countries are certainly concerned that China could do something against Taiwan in the next couple of years. It is in all our interest to deter that kind of Chinese aggression, because it would be catastrophic, not just for the Pacific, but for the entire world.
Yeah, I recall the moment when I have spoken with some Ukrainians that used to work in Beijing, and they told me, Natalie, they will never attack Taiwan, not in the way you're thinking, because they consider them as their own people, so they will never attack and kill them.
Well, isn't that exactly what the Russians said in February 2022, that the Ukrainians are our own people and Russian soldiers are your friends, and look how that's turned out. Unfortunately, I think the Chinese, who have been more than willing to kill their own people ever since the dawn of the Chinese Communist Party, and indeed no regime in the history of mankind has killed as many of its own citizens as the Chinese Communist Party has. They will be willing to kill as many Taiwanese as it takes to be able to absorb Taiwan into China. We should be in no doubt about that.
Yeah, right. General Ryan, thank you for your time again, and thank you for your thoughtful insight. It's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks, Natalie. It's always a pleasure to speak with you.